Hi, I'm Contrell Owens, a computer science PhD student studying my second year at the University of Washington, and advised by Franzi Rosner and Yoshi Kono. I worked on this project with Camille Cobb and Lori Craner when I was getting my master's degree at Carnegie Mellon. Today, I'll be talking about our work on surveillance of communication with incarcerated people. So the United States is the world leader in incarceration, both in terms of incarceration rate and the total number of people incarcerated. Incarcerated people experience surveillance, especially when communicating with family. And prisons and jails are using advanced surveillance techniques to monitor this communication. Although the described purposes of this surveillance is safety, as is the given justification for most forms of surveillance, harms must also be considered. For example, incarcerated people may not report abuse because fear of retaliation. Many people in jail haven't been convicted of a crime. Existing racial disparities in surveillance affect who's subjected to the surveillance in the first place. And finally, families have to undergo surveillance in order to communicate with their incarcerated relatives. And so to this last point, we interviewed family members of incarcerated people to better understand how surveillance impacted them. But first, I'll give some background on the prison communication and telecom landscape. The market's dominated by two major companies, GTL Technologies and Securus Technologies. And there are 5 primary methods for communicating with someone incarcerated. Phone calls, which is the most common, physical mail, electronic messaging, also known as email, but it's very different than email, video visitation, and in-person visitation. And the communication methods available at a specific facility vary widely. Some notable surveillance mechanisms involved with these communication methods include geolocation of call recipients' cell phones for an hour after they answer a phone call. So for example, if I receive a phone call from someone incarcerated and I click accept on my phone, my location will be tracked for an hour after I answer the phone call, regardless of the duration of the call itself. Geolocation has been used in the past by police to bypass the warrant process. Voice prints have been used as a biometric to track and identify people who talk to incarcerated people. And some facilities have outright banned physical mail and use private companies to scan and index it. So to better understand the privacy preferences and concerns of family members of incarcerated people and understand how they reacted to the surveillance, we interviewed 16 people who have family members incarcerated in Pennsylvania at the time of our study, December 2019. The interviews lasted for an hour and compensation was $30. We interviewed people on our campus or at public libraries near them around Allegheny County to be very flexible. And we chose to interview families of incarcerated people rather than incarcerated people themselves for a few reasons. The primary reason is that our communication with incarcerated people would be surveilled, which could bias the results or introduce risks to them. Recruitment would have been difficult, of course, and there are, of course, ethical challenges around consent and compensation when conducting research with incarcerated people. And so we asked participants about their perceptions of data collection, retention, and use in addition to general security or surveillance and privacy questions. So onto our findings. Here I break up the topics people raised into 4 different sections. I'll first start with their general communication practices that are unrelated to surveillance, their awareness of surveillance, their attitudes about surveillance, and their privacy-preserving strategies that they mentioned. So in terms of their communication practices, when asked about them, we learned that people were driven by an obligation to stay in touch with their incarcerated relative. Although, as many of them brought up, this communication can be inconvenient and costly. And so, for example, one person who was communicating with their incarcerated relative using the electronic messaging platform, which is used by incarcerated people on the tablet, like one shown here, is expensive and unreliable, saying it could take anywhere from 10 minutes to days for her incarcerated relative to receive a message that she sent. Another person referring to the electronic messaging platform said, even though it's email, they call it a stamp, you still have to pay to send the email. It's messed up because the person in the beginning didn't have any money, did the crime, and the family that has to pay for the crime didn't have any money anyway. And this quote highlights multiple things, right? So the prices per message sent on electronic messaging platforms are 25 cents or more, right? And the cost of incarceration is often offloaded onto families. Regarding participants' awareness of surveillance, most people mentioned surveillance before we asked about it, although they thought some existing surveillance mechanisms weren't possible because of legal and technical barriers. For example, one person speaking about phone calls said, I don't think they record them all. I think it's really a scare tactic because that's a lot of audio, that's a lot of transcripts, that's a lot of data right there, like where are you storing all that? Not understanding that the data storage is pretty cheap. And some participants didn't think existing policies around privacy were being followed by prison staff. And so some of the people we happened to interview were formerly incarcerated, and one person was formerly a prison guard or a correctional officer, or CO. And the CEO said, you'll be told to do things by the book, but also get them done. And those two things will be almost unreconcilable. You're not specifically told to cut those corners, but you're told like, get it done, right? And this was also corroborated by formerly incarcerated people we interviewed who said they'd seen COs breaking rules. Regarding people's attitudes about surveillance, some people mentioned discomfort and concern that their words could be manipulated against them or their incarcerated relative. So for example, one person said there's a lot of communication discussing the judicial system between the person and then their family. So there's no real communication, which doesn't tap on all three levels of letters, visits, and phone calls. But it's just difficult to communicate with someone when you know that their communications are being tracked and monitored, and of course can be used against them. The participants also mentioned that it was unfair that they were surveilled because they're not themselves incarcerated. And mentioned one person specifically said that this type of tracking can make you feel like you're a criminal because you have a loved one in prison. Regarding their perceived intentions of surveillance, right? Half the participants believe that facilities collect evidence to strengthen a legal prosecution, such as specifically to strengthen a case against someone or to get more information on what they might be in for to get more charges pressed against them. While 7 participants also mentioned safety purposes. One participant mentioned a harmful experience with surveillance, right, and in which they were flagged as trying to smuggle drugs into a facility. And she was told this could lead to her being potentially banned from the facility and her son being put into isolation. So she had this terrible experience with like a false positive. Her first time being in a prison to visit her son. Some participants, specifically the formerly incarcerated ones, mentioned that they were uncomfortable with going to prisons, specifically because of prior experiences in there. So we asked participants what privacy preserving strategies they had, if any. Some people said they used the most private communication method from in their mind. So one person specifically said mail was the most private communication method, and that was the belief in most of people, followed by the in-person visitation. And the belief around mail was led by the ability that you can potentially not put your personal return address on an envelope, and that might offer some semblance of anonymity. Participants also mentioned self-censorships when communicating with their incarcerated relatives, so avoid talking about the case, or they'll conceal the names of others to protect them. And some participants said they didn't feel like there was anything they could do, that facilities, prisons, and jails pretty much have everything. And interestingly, some people indicated that they would change their behavior if they knew some of the surveillance mechanisms that are currently in place were being used. So for example, one person said, regarding location tracking while on the phone, I would feel like I was under heavy monitoring and I was probably next in line to be arrested. I'd be less likely to receive the phone call and go to another form of communication, so I could then not have to give them my location. We ended our interviews by asking participants if they had recommendations for computer scientists or policymakers on how to make their communication experience better. And none of their recommendations focused on privacy. They were all around ease of communication and cost. And there are other recommendations included in the paper, but here I include one recommendation in full. So one person said on the programming side, none of that stuff is going to change. The only thing that's going to change is that you can make it easier for people on the outside to reach out, not only to the person, but to the judicial system to find out what's going on. But that's not going to be something that people will push for and approve, because these are people that we are meant to forget, to punish and forget innocence, but these people still have lives and people that they love and want to communicate with. And others in the study shared similar feelings about not feeling like their needs or the needs of their incarcerated relatives were cared about by others. So to summarize our findings, people believe that there were legal, practical, and technical barriers that limited the amount of surveillance they could experience. Although, as we show in the paper, these barriers are either non-existent or have little impact. Participants thought it was unfair that they were surveilled because they're themselves not incarcerated. Some people thought their words collected during surveillance could be manipulated against them or their incarcerated relatives. People brought up their privacy-preserving strategies, including using the most private communication method and self-censorship. And although this paper was focused on surveillance and privacy, participants mentioned numerous other problems and challenges of attempting to stay in touch with their incarcerated relatives outside of surveillance, such as cost, convenience, accessibility, and prior trauma in prisons. So on to our discussion. I want to mention 2 points that we raised in the paper. The first point is around this misalignment of stakeholder incentives. So private contractors, design products to work for facilities and not for the people that use their services, right? So they don't feel the need to be responsive to the needs and concerns of end users as long as they continue to make money. Right? And one piece of evidence around this is sort of the few privacy controls that exist for end users are ineffective. Although, as many people mentioned in the study, they're just general functionality issues that they have that aren't addressed. And there are a lot of examples of third-party service providers who do this in non-prison contexts as well. So, for example, ad targeting companies also don't think about the considerations of the end user, right? They're working with their client to present ads in the browser. Another point I want to discuss is that surveillance, I think, contributes to worse legal outcomes for people of color, right? So the ability to bail out of prison, to not spend time in jail, is a major predictor of legal outcomes. And I believe that this is in part because poor people who can't afford bail have all of their communication surveilled, right? And so because of the US's social stratification, right, this means that poor Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people are disproportionately the targets of the surveillance. So in a situation in which 3/4 of people in jail haven't been convicted of the crime, but still have their communication surveilled, it's possible that it's reproducing existing wealth and racial disparities in incarceration. So what do we recommend here? First, I'll focus on recommendations for end users. And there isn't much, honestly, but I think people were already doing what we were going to recommend, or most people. And we would say use the most private communication methods for your purposes, whatever form of privacy is important to you. And so mail may offer some anonymity if the return address, as mentioned before, is not yours. And assuming they aren't doing any sort of handwriting analysis, right? In-person visitations may protect the contents of your conversation if they're contact visits, right? So there are some visits where you go and see, and there's a glass window and you're on the phone on either side. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about contact visits where you're sitting right next to one another. If there isn't a CO standing right next to you, you have some reasonable belief that your conversation will be private because there's so many other people around you talking to people as well. And electronic messaging, some people said they value that because it doesn't record any audio or video, even though you have to make an account and provide some form of identification to that account to be able to use it. So they know who you are, but at least there's no video and audio content being collected. We also have some recommendations for policymakers. And some of these apply in a lot of different contexts, as you might expect. And so one is to minimize data collection, right? So massive data collection systems make systems vulnerable to massive hacks, and it produce massive risks to the people that have to use these systems. So for example, in 2015, there's a hack of Securus, one of the 2 major telecom providers that released 70 million phone records, including calls with lawyers. There's about 12,000 calls with lawyers in this database, and they were supposed to be protected by attorney-client privilege, right? And in 2020, a security company scanning the internet found an exposed database online that was run by GTL Technologies, one of the other 2 major telecom companies. And this database that was exposed and authentication required to access it had over 200 million sort of electronic messages within it that anyone could have accessed. And so when you do these massive surveillance projects and you have people that pretty much have to use these platforms, you expose them to a lot of risk. This isn't too dissimilar from the Equifax issue a few years back. Another recommendation is to increase access to data controls, especially for when people leave facilities, right? It makes a lot of sense when someone is no longer in prison, they should be able to request that their old data be deleted, and especially for their families as well. And require disclosure of surveillance practices. So the information we tried to look at to understand this study was buried in FOIA contracts, privacy policies, and news articles. This should be available. Information about surveillance should be available in the same places people access information about communication. And so in the interim, while this gap still exists between what is happening and what is displayed to people, we believe advocacy groups should share information about surveillance with impacted people. And we created a template document for organizations to use. So here's the template flyer we gave to organizations that helped us with recruiting, right? So the example facility here is Allegheny County Jail, which is of course very relevant to some of the people we work with. We point out components that we think are important to include. I'm not going to go through this whole graphic here, but you can find a link to a digital version of this in our paper. So what are the implications for privacy engineers, right? I think one important thing to consider whenever you want to protect the privacy of marginalized groups is to consider their threat models, right? And so end users, unbeknownst to you, might consider government entities as their adversaries, right? And so one example of this is sort of the smartphone probation and parole monitoring apps, where some government entities are using, operating system location API returns, right, to determine if people should go to jail or remain free. I think it's also important to consider how your technology could be used or misused to further marginalization or exacerbate social inequities or create new inequities in themselves. So for example, Securus made this platform that was supposed to be used for gathering historical location data. If someone had the proper documentation, right? And so you had to get a warrant, and the idea was you're supposed to upload the warrant into their system before accessing someone's location. And this was used by a sheriff in the past, uploading fake documents to get someone's real-time location to any cell phone number, right? This is part of their platform. And Securus got fined for this by the FCC for not verifying the documents. And I should say this is unrelated to sharing your location while on a phone call, because during the phone call, they say you give consent when you press accept. But this tool was misused and abused by law enforcement. And lastly, diversify your teams, right? So there's this race of interviewer effect that has been shown to have an impact when people are interviewed about a lot of topics, but specifically about police violence, right? And I think having someone from marginalized groups on your teams can sort of add strength to the validity, some people, right, on your team can add strength to the validity of your results if you want to interview people and about topics that may be sensitive and get honest answers. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for watching this talk, and I'll take any questions.